Well, the culture around us continues to evolve, and Canada has unfortunately seen a decline in those who believe in God in the last 15 years, contrary to what's actually happening across much of the rest of the world. But it's all not bad news for the church, and a big part of that is thanks to immigration. But ultimately, churches who are thriving are doing so by responding to the cultural shifts we're seeing. And today we're going to talk about how some of those churches are doing it right across Canada. To help us on this journey are two very accomplished journalists and authors, Patricia Patty and Karen Stiller. Thank you so much for coming in.
Thank you.
Now, you were actually commissioned to write this book by World Vision, which is a little unusual in a sense, but what were your thoughts when you were asked to take a look at the church across Canada?
I think our first thought was one of excitement and joy and gratitude that it is unusual to be asked to write a book and given the resources to do it. And so that was a wonderful opportunity for us as writers. And we both are lovers of the church. We're longtime members. We believe in the Canadian church. So to have an opportunity to dig in and tell really good news stories was just amazing.
Mm-hmm. And that's really what the book is. It's really diverse. It's 40 stories basically in chapters of different churches who are doing things, and you covered 25 denominations and 35 cities. So it's not a narrow view, it's a pretty wide view. How did you accomplish that?
Well, we started off, Cheryl, World Vision conducted a series of forums for church leaders across Canada last spring. This is something that they do every year to basically equip church leaders and offer them helpful resources. And last spring, what the forum looked at was some of the statistics highlighting the changes in Canadian culture. So how culture has changed over the past number of years in terms of immigration and changes in the family, changes among youth, and in terms of Canadians' use of their time, their money, and their finances. And so coming out of those forums, people that participated were asked to share good news stories about churches that were doing innovative things in their own communities. And World Vision had a list of about 200 churches that they passed on to Karen and I. And then it was our initial task to sort through all of those churches and kind of decide which were the stories that really needed to be highlighted.
Wow, that must have been a challenge. And both of you cover the church quite extensively as it is. So did you feel like going into this, like, I have a pretty good idea? And was there anything that surprised you?
I think we always, if I can speak for both of us here, approach our work ready to be surprised, because I think I'm always surprised by what the church is doing, by what God is doing, and just how those two work together in Canada. So I think we were surprised at the diversity of activity, that churches are being really creative. I think that we can buy into the idea that the church in Canada is really struggling and facing these impossible obstacles. And I was pleasantly surprised to discover that the church is doing really great things, and that numbers don't matter, that smaller congregations can do amazing things in their communities. That's was really great to see.
Well, let's take a look at some of what the church, let's give some examples and see if we can inspire some ideas today in people who are watching. So starting in the Maritimes, you have a church that you want to give an example of.
One of my favorites was in Charlottetown, Prince Edward Island, Cornerstone Community Church, a Baptist congregation. They noticed that their city was becoming very multi-ethnic, that immigration was really having an impact in Charlottetown. So the outreach pastor went to meet with a government immigration office and said, hey, we have a whole congregation who can help with things, like use us. And the wonderful part of this story is that the government office said, yeah, I get that. Like this pastor represents a couple of hundred people. So they released the church to help with events and so on, and that grew to like English language services and community dinners out of the church itself for the immigrant community in Charlottetown. And so that was really great. It started with questions, it started with humility, and then they just got really creative.
I think the great thing is, when you're in leadership of the mayor of a city, most people come to you with their problems. Yeah. Very few people come to you saying, what are your challenges and what can I do to help? I mean, that must be some of the most refreshing things that leadership ever hears, and probably pretty rare as well. So I think that's so smart.
And we actually spoke to the government office in Charlottetown and said, like, what was it like? What did you think? And this one fellow anyway was, intuitive enough to go, yeah, this is a body of volunteers ready. Like, how often does that happen? So
yeah,
that was
completely
pretty neat.
rare. That's a beautiful story. And
Yeah.
so now going to the far north, do you have any stories from there? And I love that because I've spent time up there, and it's just so good always to see what God's doing. The media were always covering the negative stories, right?
Yes, yeah, absolutely, Cheryl. And one of our favorites was a teeny tiny little church located on an Indian reservation in the Northwest Territories called the Dene Pentecostal Church.
I've been there.
You have?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. They fed me a great meal.
Well, you know then, Cheryl, that on a good day, a good Sunday, the pastor tells us that the congregation swells to about 20 people. So
Yeah.
that's the size
20
of the
amazing people.
Yes, the size of the congregation. But yet for a small church, they're doing amazing things. And what the story that we found focuses on is the reality that they have helped to construct a children's Bible camp, and it's the only children and youth Bible camp located in the Northwest Territories. Prior to Camp Paradise opening up a few years ago, the children in the Northwest Territories had to travel many, many hours by boat or train or plane or car or a combination of those things down into BC or Alberta or Saskatchewan in order to go to a camp.
Yeah,
And
for thousands of dollars.
Exactly, exactly. And now they have their own camp, and it focuses on unique needs to that community and those cultures. So First Nations children are learning trapping and fishing and hunting, which are not the typical things that we may think of that go along with your Bible study and your camp songs around the campfire, but it's meeting the need for that particular community, and it's creating, cultivating future leaders, generations of leaders.
What a beautiful picture as we're hearing from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission this week about how many times religious communities try to take away people's cultures in the North, and to have people of faith actually doing things to restore culture and teach kids about culture, that is, so important, such strategic ministry, I would say. So moving on, I want to make sure we cover as much as we can in the time that we have. What about the Prairies? Who has a story from the Prairies?
In a couple of churches in the Prairies, we saw a theme that came out in the church or in the book with youth ministry, where there was a church in Winnipeg that instead of sort of serving their youth or ministering to their youth, they were pulling their youth into ministry to the community. So really calling their youth to a higher level of service and missional expression in their community. And that was through a gym night.
Some of those churches actually lost members, right? Because
Yes,
people said that
exactly.
they didn't want to have to do that. They just wanted to come and be served.
Exactly. That was Compass Church in Regina. He was very open with us that, some families said, well, I want my kids to be ministered
entertained,
to.
yeah.
But what we heard again and again was that when kids are released into ministry, they're actually growing in their faith and seeing God work in a really amazing way. So that was very encouraging.
I love that story because I remember as a young person going to church and events and wanting to make a difference in the world. That's always been part of my DNA, and not having the chance and just waiting, literally just waiting till I'm old enough that people would take me seriously, that I could do something.
Yeah, exactly.
And I don't ever want to see that for another child or another teenager. So I applaud churches that are doing that. Well, let's go to Alberta. Do you have a story from Alberta?
Yeah, absolutely. So right on the border between Alberta and Saskatchewan, there's a town called Lloydminster. And Lloydminster, First Baptist Church in Lloydminster, again, touched on the same theme. We looked at their youth group. They had a youth pastor there, a vibrant, active, engaging fellow by the name of Darren Butte. And Darren told us that at some point in his youth ministry, he started to feel like he was more of an entertainer or an event planner, an event coordinator than a youth pastor. And met with his youth ministry team, and they started by asking the question, okay, what we're supposed to be doing here is creating disciples, not just creating fun events every Friday night. So what do disciples look like, and what kinds of things do disciples do? And what Darren told us is that games were not on the list. So their youth group immediately made a complete about-face. They canceled Sunday morning Sunday school so that the youth were released to serve during the Sunday morning worship service time. They instituted a midweek small group that's where the kids got together and had their Bible study and worship time. And the focus really became in their meetings was on meeting God and serving the needs of their fellow believers. And the initial result was the youth group went from about 60 down to about 25, which was scary for them, but they saw that as an adjustment period and they were committed to what they were doing. And by the end of the first year, their group was composed differently, but their numbers exceeded where they had been before they made the change. And they're seeing the fruits of it. Kids are staying now after graduation. They're not leaving like in so many churches, and they're staying and they're ministering to middle school kids and younger. So it's a wonderful story,
There's so much more of Canada to cover. I know you covered Quebec, which I loved, and Nunavut, and BC and Ontario. But I want to just talk a little bit before we go here about the bigger picture things that you learned. So if a church is watching, or a pastor is watching, or people of faith are watching, and they're saying, I want to know how to be more relevant in this changing culture that I'm in, what can they do? What are some of the things that you learned?
Common themes that we saw: listening. Churches listened first to the needs in the community. They asked good questions. A big question that got asked again and again was, what if? What if we tried this? What if we, partnered with that person or that group? And asking questions really brought great answers. So that was a strong theme.
And that takes an attitude of humility as well,
Absolutely.
right? Not thinking that we have the answers, but really just having that spirit of humility. Karen?
And then not just asking questions, but listening to the answers, and then taking those answers to heart, being willing to take risks, being willing to try things. Oftentimes the stories that were highlighted in this book came as the result of a long process of churches engaging with their communities and wrestling through different, trial and error strategies and whatnot until they found the right fit for meeting the needs of their communities, but they were willing to take risks and not afraid of failure.
Well, I noticed too that you had said in your book that, Canada is the most, let me get it right, multi-ethnic, multicultural, multi-religious population on the planet with more than 200 ethnicities represented across our country. And I saw a real theme here in this book. A lot of people were responding to the needs of immigrants. Tell me about that. How key is that?
Well, as recent studies showed, the Angus Reid study that just came out, immigration is having a huge impact on the Canadian church. So in every community, and a fellow in the Yukon said to us, if you walk down the street and see, an ethnically diverse population, that's what you should be seeing in your church. And we saw that again and again. So the church is providing sometimes a home to an ethnic immigrant congregation that's on its own, and just providing space and shelter and time, but also that the immigrant population is also being just fully integrated into the church, because the church is opening their arms and realizing this is a vital part of the Christian population in Canada.
So, we hear a lot of bad news about the church. We started talking about that. Do you have hope for the Canadian church having seen this?
Absolutely, Cheryl. We both found this project deeply encouraging. As Karen began this interview, we both love the church. We have a real heart for the church. We've grown up in the church. We've spent our whole lives in churches and attended various churches and covered the stories of Canadian churches for decades. And to see churches thriving and doing so well in spite of the cultural shifts in Canada was deeply encouraging. Things are the church is alive and well.
I love hearing that, and you guys have brought great examples and inspiration, I think, to churches and people of faith about how we can be more relevant, how we can respond to the shifts around us. So thank you for all the hard work that you put into that. I'm sure a lot of people don't realize how much work a book actually is, but I loved it. Thank you so much for coming.
We had a lot of fun.
And I mentioned good news at the top. The good news is that the church is alive and well in Canada and making a difference. Hopefully you're part of one of those local communities. If not, look around you, see where you can get involved, because I think as people of faith, that's our job, to make a difference.